some preparation for them to start receiving the law. Next week when we break open chapter 20, that is the very first part of the law, and it starts with the Ten Commandments. And so that's where we'll be at next week. But tonight we have to get Israel prepared to receive the law, and God has some special instructions for them. As you see there on the screen, we're still in chapter 19 at the time of about 1446 BC. It won't be long before that counter clicks over to another couple of years for us as we work through the scriptures. But nevertheless, tonight we are in chapter 19, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 6 to begin with, and we're going to see how Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. So read in your Bibles, follow along with me in verses 1 through 6. It says, "In the third month of from the very day the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came to the Sinai wilderness. They traveled from Rephidim, came to the Sinai wilderness, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Moses went up the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, 'This is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites.'" So the Israelites have left Egypt, and they left Egypt in the month of Abib. And this is the calendar for the Israelites changed when they went into exile. They adjusted their months. It falls more in line with a Babylonian method of record keeping, time keeping, and things like that. So now that month is the month of Nisan, like the vehicle, but only one S. It's pronounced the same way. But they left Egypt in the month of Nisan, and they arrived at Mount Sinai 3 months later in what is now known as the month of Sivan. And it was from the 15th day to the 15th day. So it took them 3 months to travel from this region in Egypt all the way down and across, and then down to Rephidim, and then down to across to Mount Sinai. And when they arrived at Mount Sinai, what we find is the scripture is very clear. They camped in front of the mountain. They camped in the plateau in front of the mountain. And this is the view. I got this off of, I think it was off of Google Maps. But this is the view from the Mount Sinai in the southern Sinai. There's a couple of different ones that we've been talking about that people say could potentially be it. We are going with the southern route, as you see where we were at. But this is the view from Mount Sinai down to the plateau below. There's another picture too, I think I've got there. It's a little more clear there. But this shows you the view of where most likely the Israelites would have been camping while Moses, goes up onto the mountain to meet with God. Now, Darryl, stay on that picture for just a second. Now, if you look there, there's this mountain range in the back, and they would have been somewhere I guess instead of just waving my fingers at it, I could use the pointer in my hand, right? That would help. Y'all know your pastor doesn't have any sense. It's okay. But you see this mountain range right here that, even as small as it is. But they would have camped somewhere down here on the plateau most likely. Now, can you imagine Moses at 80 years old traveling up the mountain and trying to get up the mountain somehow up onto Mount Sinai? And it is not... The view that you see down from it is very steep looking back from the plateau up. It's not like he was walking on nice graded ground or anything like that. So Moses would have climbed that a couple of times. So remember this view that you see that Moses had to climb, because we're going to talk about Moses and him making that trek up and down the mountain a couple of times in tonight's text. And so Moses, when they get there, Moses goes up onto the mountain to meet with God. And Moses would have been familiar with this area because of his time shepherding for his father-in-law Jethro. And he would have remembered it from his time with the encounter with God at the burning bush. And so this area would have been somewhat familiar to Moses, even though it had been several months since he'd been there. Now, God spoke to Moses while he was on the mountain and gave him a message to go down and relay to Israel. And it's verses 4 through 6. He says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation." And so Moses makes the trek up the mountain, time number 1. And he gets there, and he's meeting with God, and God is talking with him, and he tells him this. And this is sort of, the beginning of the covenant for Israel at Mount Sinai. He's saying, look, I've chosen you to be my people. If you'll follow my commands, then you're going to be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. You're going to be my people, my chosen people. And so he reminded them of his provision and his protection as they left from Egypt. And then the details of the covenant are given in an albeit condensed version. That's what we find here. If Israel would listen to God and keep his covenant, then Israel would be God's chosen people, as he put it, as I said a moment ago, a kingdom of priests and holy nation. Again, we refer to Israel as God's chosen people, and that's really what it is. He says even there, you will be my own people out of a possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. So God is saying, look, everybody is mine, but I have chosen you. You are my chosen people to be this kingdom of priests and this holy nation. And so we look on into verses 7 through 15, and this is where we see that God prescribes for Israel this consecration that needed to go on before he could give them the law, before they could begin the real work of the covenant. And so look at verses 7 through 15 with me. It says, "After Moses came back, he summoned the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. Then all the people responded together, 'We will do all that the Lord has spoken.' So Moses brought the people's words back to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, 'I am going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear when I speak with you and will always believe you.' Moses reported the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, 'Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. They must wash their clothes and be prepared by the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put boundaries for the people all around the mountain and say, be careful that you don't go up on the mountain or touch its base. Anyone who touches the mountain must be put to death. No hand may touch him. Instead, he will be stoned or shot with arrows and not live, whether animal or human. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up the mountain.' Then Moses came down from the mountain to the people and consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. He said to them, 'Be prepared by the third day. Do not have sexual relations with women.'" So Moses is playing middleman between the Israelites and God. So he is basically relaying messages back and forth. And so right now, Moses is up on the mountain getting this message of covenant and consecration from God. And so while he's up there, he receives this message. And then when Moses made his way down off of the mountain and to the camp, he gathered all of the elders of Israel and told them exactly what God said. And the elders agreed with what God had said about them being a holy nation and being God's chosen people, and them following the covenant and doing everything that God expected of them. And so the elders agreed. They said, "We will do all that Yahweh or all that the Lord has spoken." So Moses makes it a trip back up the mountain, time number 2. And so he starts back up the mountain to go and relay to God the answer from the elders. Now, let's do a little theological thinking here for a moment. God is omniscient, right? And God is omniscient, meaning that he knows everything, right? And Moses is a pretty savvy guy. He's been trained in, the Hebrew faith and all of this. Can you imagine the thoughts going through Moses' mind as he is making trip number 2 up the mountain to tell God something he already knows at 80 years old? He's going up the mountain to tell God that the elders down in the valley are going to agree to what you say, and God already knows it. So you can imagine how, there has to be these feelings of, what am I doing here? Why am I playing middleman if God knows what they're going to do, if God knows what they're going to say? But nevertheless, that's what's going on. Moses is making his way back up the mountain, time number 2, to give the elders' answer to God. And so when Moses arrived at that meeting place that he had with God, he shared the elders' message, and God told Moses what he planned to do. He told him, he laid out for him his plan of consecration for Israel to prepare them to be able to experience the covenant and the giving of the law. And so we see this as really the very beginning of the giving of the law, as Moses would receive it from God. But Moses was still in the dark. Even though he had traveled the mountain a couple of times and relayed messages both ways, he was still in the dark as to what God had planned at this point, what God was planning to do. The only thing that he would have known about was the fact that God had told him at the burning bush that the sign that he was Yahweh, that he was the God of the Israelites, was that when they came out of Egypt, they would worship him on this mountain. So he knew that they would be there to worship him, and that was really the only thing that Moses had as far as any idea of God's plans up to this point. And so God wanted the people to consecrate themselves. And so he wanted them to understand that this is a very holy event in the history of Israel, and he wants them to be consecrated. And so the term consecrate just means to sanctify or to make holy. And so when we've talked about on Wednesday nights during our study of Romans and talking about sanctification, it's the same thing. Consecration, sanctification, they are very similar. That they would consecrate or sanctify the articles that would be used for worship in the temple, the golden vessels and things like that. They would sanctify them. They would make them holy, and then they couldn't be used for anything else unless you were a crazy Babylonian leader who decides to use them, the golden cups and stuff, on the last night of the Babylonian Empire, because Daniel comes in and says, guess what? You've used this and God's found you lacking. And so we see that these things are consecrated. They are set apart. And that is exactly what God is wanting Moses to get across to the Israelites, is that he is about to consecrate. He needs them to be consecrated for what is about to happen. He needs them to be sanctified. He needs them to be made holy. And so there was a prescription here that God gave them to do that. And so God wanted them to be prepared to interact with him through the giving of the law. God is about to give the law, and he wants them to be consecrated and prepared for this holy event. And so because this event was such a holy time, that God required Moses to even go and put up a boundary around the mountain, so that the people would not venture up the mountain to try and see God or to get a glimpse of him. Excuse me. And so God tells him to put up a boundary, to basically put up a marker for the people not to go beyond. And in this request, what God is doing is he is setting people up to worship in God's presence, but with a separation between God and man. This is maybe a foreshadowing, or maybe the best term. This is a bit of a foreshadowing as to what would happen in temple worship, where only the priest could go into the Holy of Holies. And so Moses going onto the mountain and the people staying outside of the boundary. This is very similar to that. And so God is already putting into the minds of the Israelites that worship is a holy event, that they cannot just come into the presence of God as if it was just an average everyday thing. There was something to be said for being holy and consecrated in worship before a holy God. And that's what he's wanting them to see. So what we see here on Mount Sinai with Moses and the people behind the boundary is very similar to what is happening in not just tabernacle worship during the 40 years in the wilderness, but also in the temple whenever the people finally have a temple and are able to worship God, and the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies. Now, what ends up happening, excuse me, what ends up happening is that if any person or animal violated this command to not go beyond the boundary, they were to be executed either by stoning or being shot by arrows. You couldn't place a hand on them, but you could shoot an arrow at them, evidently, from what God's command is here. You could stone them, but you weren't to lay hands on them. And so Moses comes down the mountain his second time here and came down and prepared the people by consecrating them in obedience to God's commands. Now, in verses 16 through 25, we find that God meets with Moses on Mount Sinai one more time. I'm going to have to cough. I'm going to take my mic off, and then I'll read the verse for us. Excuse me. Now if I can figure out how I had that on there to begin with. There we go. All right, so beginning in verse 16, it says, "On the third day, when morning came, there was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud blast from a ram's horn, so that all the people in the camp shuddered. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord came down on it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. As the sound of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai at the top of the mountain. Then the Lord summoned Moses to the top of the mountain, and he went up. The Lord directed Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through to see the Lord, otherwise many of them will die. Even the priests who come near the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out in anger against them." Moses responded to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai since you warned us. Put a boundary around the mountain and consecrate it." And the Lord replied to him, "Go down and come back with Aaron, but the priest and the people must not break through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out in anger against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. So here we find on this third day of consecration, God met with Israel from up on top of the mountain. Up on top of Mount Sinai, God is there. And we get this idea that they wake up, it's sort of like when we wake up and there's snow on the ground. It's like, whoa, this is kind of neat to see. It's a cool thing to notice. Well, they come out of their tents and there is smoke and fire and clouds on top of Mount Sinai, and they are probably just as, even more in awe of that than we are of snow. But nevertheless, they are looking at it, and the entire top of Mount Sinai is enveloped in this. They're hearing thunder and seeing lightning up on top of the mountain. And to add to that, there is this loud horn, this loud ram's horn that blasts, and it startled the camp. So you can imagine, as far away from the top of the mountain as they would have been, you imagine how loud it had to be for it to startle the camp. And this ain't like, oh, what's that sound? This is a, oh no, what is that sound type thing. They are absolutely startled by the sound of this ram's horn that is obviously something that God has done in this moment to, have part in this, this interaction with the people. And so Moses brought the people out to the boundary markers that had been set up at the base of the mountain. So he led the people out to the base of the mountain as far as they could come, and they knew that they couldn't go any further. And as the Israelites looked up at the top of the mountain, what we find is that the smoke just sort of rose up like out of a furnace, out of a chimney. And, not only did the smoke rise up off of the mountain, but the mountain shook violently. And so God had descended on the mountain, and as Moses even recorded, he descended in fire. So there is this, spectacle of God arriving on Mount Sinai to meet with Israel and give them the law. They have been consecrated. A holy God has come to meet with them on Mount Sinai. This is one of those moments that it would be interesting to be a fly on the wall to watch, just like with the crossing of the Red Sea, to see this moment in the history of Israel and to understand the buildup as we've uncovered here in chapter 19, just this tremendous buildup to this event, and then God himself steps out of the spiritual realm in some way to the top of Mount Sinai, and the people are in awe watching what goes on. And and remember that, they don't even see God. They only see the other things going on around him. They don't even get a glimpse of him in this moment. And think about how in awe they are of him and this moment. And all they're doing is hearing thunder, seeing lightning, smoke and fire, and all of this. And this is this holy moment where Moses is going to be the one who comes and gets the law and brings it back to the people. And so when they hear this ram's horn, and it, as the text says, it continues to grow louder and louder, Moses spoke with God, and God answered him in the thunder, as Moses recorded. Can you imagine the Israelites trying to take all of this in, and even after witnessing all of the plagues in Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea, they've experienced unbelievable things already in their lives. But here they're experiencing something even just as amazing. And, they had to be very fearful in that moment from watching what God had done in the past, what he did to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh and to all of that. And now, here is God moving powerfully in their presence. And, but they knew that they could trust him because of the covenants that he had, what he had told them. And they knew that they could trust God's covenant in this moment. So God reiterated with Moses the requirement that the people stay behind the boundary markers at the base of the mountain. God's like, look, you need to go and tell them they have to stay behind that. Do you think that God reiterating this, even though Moses is like, but you've already told us we can't do that, so they're not going to do it? For those of you that were here on Wednesday night, do you think that God is telling Moses to remind the Israelites because, again, they just have to be told it's off limits, and what are they going to want to do? Push past the limits, like we talked about on Wednesday night with sin and temptation. And I put my bottle over here, and I said, if I say don't touch my bottle over here, what's somebody going to do? They're going to come up and they're going to touch the bottle. Or wet paint, what are you going to do? You see a sign, you're going to touch wet paint. Well, we were talking about that in regards to sin and our reaction, God, telling us, don't do this. Well, what is our natural human tendency? To go and do that. That's just the way we are as humans. God tells the people of Israel, don't go beyond this boundary. And what are they going to want to do? He don't really mean that. We can get a little closer. We can see a little better. And then the next thing you know, you're being stoned or shot with arrows by the other Israelites. But nevertheless, we see that God is telling Moses once again, go and tell them, because God knows us. He knows our tendencies. And in verse 22, God even begins to set up the priest and his role in worship, and told Moses that they must be consecrated to come near God, that even the priest had to do that. And so this will be a key part of the priest and his responsibility in presiding over worship from the time, really from now in the biblical text, through the time of the tabernacle to the time of the temple. And so what we find is that God's final command to Moses after Moses tells him, hey, you've already told us that we can't go past the boundary markers, so we're not going to do that. God's final command to Moses was to go down and bring Aaron back with him. And so Moses goes down to tell the priest and the people not to go past the boundary marker. And so when Moses went up to meet with God on this third day, that was his third time going up Mount Sinai.